All right. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Muhammad Khalil. I'm the director of the Muslim Studies program at Michigan State, and we thank you all for joining us for this webinar entitled "Navigating Shomoyscapes." I hope I pronounced that correctly. Temporality and Faculty Life in Dhaka, Bangladesh. We have an outstanding panel for you this morning, or if you're in Bangladesh this evening. And I'd like to begin by thanking our co-sponsors. They include the Asian Studies Center, the College of Education, and Global Studies in the Arts and Humanities. I also want to make sure to thank Mary Ferdowsi for setting this up. And I want to thank you all for joining us. I want to let you know that if you'd like transcription, you can actually, there's a transcription option. On my laptop, I see it here at the bottom. So you can actually enable live transcription if you'd like that. So why don't we go ahead and get started? What we're going to do, I'm going to introduce all three presenters, and then they will sort of speak together, so to speak, kind of tag teaming. So let me go ahead and introduce our three presenters. First is someone familiar to many of us, and that's Professor Riyad Shahjahan. Riyad A. Shahjahan is an associate professor of higher adult and lifelong education, or HALE, at Michigan State University. He's also a core faculty member of Muslim Studies, Chicano Latino Studies, Asian Studies, and Center for Advanced Study of International Development. His research interests are in globalization of higher education, decolonizing curriculum or pedagogy, temporality and embodiment in higher education, cultural studies, and or anti or post-colonial theory. The next presenter, the other presenter here with us, is Nisharggo Niloy. I hope I pronounced the name correctly. Niloy completed his post-graduation from the Department of Anthropology at the University of Dhaka. His interests include political communication in the public sphere, modernity in South Asia, partisan tendencies in South Asian politics, neocolonialism, rhetoric, and semiotics. And last but certainly not least is our third presenter, and that's Tasnmi Emma. Tasnmi A. Emma is an undergraduate student at the Department of Anthropology at University of Dhaka, Bangladesh. Her interests primarily include medical anthropology, the political economy of health and illness, political ecology, and migration. And with that, I will now turn it over to the panel. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. And I want to quickly give a shout out to Dr. Khalil for, we were trying to arrange this even last term. It didn't work out, but I'm so glad he's been patient and persistent. And of course, Mary Ferdowsi, who's been superb in advertising and so forth. So thank you to both. I also want to acknowledge that the study we're going to share with you has been funded by Asian Studies Coup Endowment Fund, right? As well as my own department, the Educational Administration. So hope everyone is safe and healthy given what we're going through. But even though we're going to talk about something in the Bangladeshi context, and basically what we're discussing, we did this study pre-pandemic. Actually, we finished it right before the pandemic started. But hopefully, based on what we're going to talk about, especially when we're going to introduce and apply the concept of Shomoyscape, I hope you see resonance in terms of what's going on in our lives during the pandemic, okay? Because one of the things we're going to talk about is the centrality of precarity in our temporal lives, okay? So with that said, I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. Can everyone see this right now? Yeah, okay, perfect. All right, so basically we started this because my previous work has been looking at the role of time or temporality. And by temporality, what I'm referring to is how we relate and make sense of time in our lives, okay? And usually we often conflate time with clock time. That's just one way of understanding time. There are many forms of understanding that's also culturally dependent and so forth. So most of my work has been looking at temporality, mostly in the global north. And what I noticed in that literature is that they tend to focus mostly on North American, European university context, particularly research universities. And the themes that emerged there was basically how people were experiencing acceleration, speed, digitization, and the affective responses. In other words, stress and anxiety they were experiencing as these universities were going through neoliberal reform or increasingly more privatized and more audit culture. But very little was written, or I would say none. We're really looking at the global South context, except for my colleague in Chile, Caroline Guzman Valenzuela, who wrote something on time, but it wasn't the primary focus. So I was very fortunate to get funding from the Coup Endowment Fund here in Asian Studies to do something looking at the question of temporality in the context of a global South context like Bangladesh. And in order to kind of get us started with this, what I want to do is first share with you a narrative from one of our faculty. Now, this is Shobuj. Shobuj did his PhD in the global North. And it's interesting in this narrative, he compares his experiences, life in the global North versus his life in Dhaka, Bangladesh. So he says, well, I used to plan before, but then I realized that in our situation in Bangladesh, plans don't work. So I have given up planning. Now adapt to the situation. I mean, nothing is very predictable. Unpredictability is very high. I asked him, is it because of people? He says, because of culture. The situation becomes something that is out of my control. And then he talks about his experience in the global North. Everything was under my control, but here you never know what happens when, and uncertainty. So in other words, what Shobuj is doing, who's basically a full professor in the social sciences at a public university, he raises the question of temporal inefficiencies in traffic, in the meetings. And for him, and in his context, time management, this idea that we can manage our time, is a misnomer. He uses his own time map from Western time map, i.e. the predictable Western time map, to articulate his own experiences with temporality in the context of global South context like Bangladesh. And so we raise the question, where are such perspectives in the literature? And so that's why we are going to introduce to you the concept of Shomoyscape that emerged from this study and show you how it applies, okay? We're going to turn it over to Niloy now.
Hello everyone, and good morning and good evening. So let's start with a demonstration of the overview of Bangladesh. Bangladesh is currently the world's 8th most populous country. The state of Michigan in US alone is 1.5 times bigger than Bangladesh in terms of space. But Bangladesh has 16 times more population than Michigan. That's huge. And its GDP per capita is about $1,700, where Michigan's GDP, only just Michigan, the state of Michigan's GDP per capita is more than $47,000. So you can get the differences here. According to World Bank, it has one of the fastest growing economies in South Asia, Bangladesh. As a result, people in Bangladesh are experiencing rapid urbanization, overcrowding, numerous kinds of environmental pollution, and unequal distribution of wealth. Along with the emergence of modernity and capitalism, Bangladesh has also experienced temporal transition. For instance, agriculture-based Bengali calendar is being gradually replaced by the Gregorian calendar. People once expressed time with the Bengali notion of Bela. Nowadays, expression of time has become more industrial. People mostly depend on modern clock time. There are two major political parties in Bangladesh who also entrenched their temporal changes to establish the historical narratives of those parties. For example, the party which comes to power introduces their own events and holidays to the calendar, and people have to follow them. Now let's get into the overview of Bangladeshi higher education sector. Let's go to the next slide, please. So the overlapping timescapes in higher education sector is connected to the British colonialism, which started in 1757 in Bangladesh. The public universities in Bangladesh were first established by the British Raj. The first university was established in 1921. And on the other hand, the private universities were introduced in 1990s after the liberation of Bangladesh, they mostly follow the American models. Temporal differences can be observed in the public and private sectors in the context of state politics, accountability, hiring, and research funding. So we focused on the universities situated in the greater region of Dhaka for 3 reasons. Firstly, this is the capital and the largest city in Bangladesh in terms of area and population. Secondly, Dhaka is the hub of higher education in Bangladesh. 55 private and 11 public higher education institutions are located in Dhaka, including numerous affiliated institutions of 2 public universities who also offer higher degrees. Thirdly, Dhaka is experiencing rapid economic and infrastructural growth. So we could connect with a diverse pool of respondents based on gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic class, and region. So next, Emma will demonstrate the idea of Shomoyscape that we used here. Let's get back to her. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening. So I am going to explain to you the idea of Shomoyscape that we introduced in this paper, which is very much modeled, not very much, but in a way modeled after Adam's notion of timescapes, but we differ from Adam on certain points of views, and I will explain them to you how Shomoyscapes can be similar or different from timescapes. So first of all, Adam's idea of timescape, it basically means a temporal assemblage of temporal features that implicate each other but not have the same amount of implication in one instance. So basically, to summarize the timescape that Adam coined, it meant a temporal landscape. And this landscape, which she said that word scape is very important as well because it denotes the inseparability of time from space or context. This is where we take Adam's timescapes into Shomoyscapes, but we move beyond from that. The next slide, please, Dr. S. So in the next slide, we talk about how Shomoyscape. Thank you, Dr. S. So in this slide, we talk about how Shomoyscape is different from timescapes. Shomoyscape, as Dr. S argued in the beginning of this presentation, he said how many of the global North literature don't really corroborate with the realities in the global South. And this is where Shomoyscape comes in because we aim to make it a culturally situated notion, meaning that, first of all, the Shomoyscape, the concept of Shomoyscape, it talks about it talks about collective agency, not individual agency that we see in the global North per se. I mean, it does have certain aspects of individual agency. It is present, but here we see a cultural situatedness of relational temporality. By that, I mean the social cultural logics that underlie the notions of how we see temporality. To explain, for example, when in a family dinner, for example, a dinner doesn't really begin until an elder comes to the dinner and the others have to wait for him or her because that is how the norm is, the social culture is here. So that is a collective agency that you can't always do something or pursue something because you don't just have an individual agency. You also have to take into account the social cultural logic that make you think about the way you think about temporality. So that being the first point. The second point is the local global South temporal constraint. In echo of the first point, the local global South temporal constraints basically means the constraints that the global South countries often see, and Bangladesh is no different than that. For example, I will highlight an example in traffic, in the section of traffic, that how one has to take into account the infrastructural precarity of not having the space of parking one's car and having to plan according to that. So that is the one type of temporal constraint. That is a constraint which is that is a precarity, infrastructural precarity, which in turn creates a temporal constraint per se. So that is a type of temporal constraint that we can see here among many others. And these constraints or precarities are created by rapid urbanization, the developing economy, and the pollution, and many more. Last but not the least is the temporal agency. Temporal agency is a term by Precarity, and this basically means the way of customizing or manipulating one's own temporal experience or that of others. So when we talk about temporal agency, Precarity described how temporal agency can be enacted in a number of ways. It can be the resequencing of temporal components in one's life, or recalibrating the temporal components in one's life, juggling or folding, prioritizing. We will explain a few of them in the next sections when we go into the description of our paper. But for now, I can give you one example for which is recalibration. Is something like you have one priority, but your mother or father needs someone to take. You need to be there for your mother and father to have dinner with them or breakfast with them. So that is when you have to recalibrate in a way. So that is a type of temporal agency that society talks about. And this agency that we're talking about, all of this the idea of temporality, Shomoyscapes, all of it is dependent on social differences. And these differences can vary from gender to ethnicity and many more. Also seniority, workplace seniority, familial seniority, and many other examples can be given. I can give you one example of how gender differences can work here. For example, the males in our culture in Bangladesh, in the Bengali culture per se, are mainly responsible for the financial things, the things that relate to property, those sort of things, while females predominantly are basically responsible for taking care of some people, their seniors or kids, and so forth, giving them emotional support or the support they need to go on with their daily chores. So this is how social differences and many other things implicate Shomoyscape. Shomoyscape is culturally situated for a global south context like Bangladesh. It basically highlights temporal construct, temporal agency, along with a few other notions that Adam elaborated. So moving on, Dr. S will take over the presentation.
So basically, I want to quickly set the context of the data for this study. So basically what we did, and this is, as I said, pre-pandemic, we did this around between January and February, right before the pandemic began. I left Bangladesh and I was back in the United States and on a sabbatical at that time. And I had the pleasure of working both with Emma and Niloy to collect all this data. And so we interviewed 22 Bangladeshi academics. We visited various campuses across 4 different universities located in Dhaka. 2 of these were public research universities, 2 were private. Among the private, one was a small teaching, while the other was research intensive. We had 9 females and 12 males. Again, I don't want to go into too much of the demographics, but you have a broad representation between senior and junior academics. But I think what's very important for us to really talk about here also is not just the institutions that we're working on, but the fields that are represented, from all the way from hard sciences, biomedical, social sciences, humanities, and fine arts. And this is very interesting for me as someone who studies higher education, is that by talking to faculty from different disciplines, it was interesting how their temporal landscape looked differently because of the nature of their work tied to their discipline. In other words, someone working in a lab versus someone teaching in the fine arts, their lives look differently because the student expectations, the nature of work was quite different and the research was different. So anyway, that was very interesting. And so these semi-structured interviews were about 60 to 80 minutes. They were done in Bengali or English, and they covered different aspects of academic life, i.e. roles and tasks, trajectory, academic career, work-life balance, including also their perceptions of time, and of course, their relationships and dilemmas with time. We then engaged in open coding, and we used writing as a method of inquiry, and we can go into details about that if people are interested in knowing what those are, okay? But the point of this presentation and our paper that has actually come out, and we're gonna send a link to you later in the after this, it just came out in December, we basically are suggesting that Bangladeshi faculty experience and navigate Shomoyscape that are constituted by both. So in other words, Shomoyscapes is tied to 2 things. Number 1, larger temporal forces or constraints. Those are spatial, structure, or cultural. And 2, their temporal agency in response to these same constraints. So Shomoyscape is a landscape of both constraints and temporal agency. I think that's very important to keep in mind. And we're going to illuminate now how Shomoyscape manifested through various temporal constraints, such as 1, traffic, party-based university politics, and C, it should be caring for others, not the future of others, but yeah, okay?
Okay, so I am going to tell you about how traffic invokes resequencing or folding time. And before I start, I would like to say, if you have trouble hearing me due to the internet connection, please give me a heads up in the chat box. Anyhow, So we talk about traffic as the first temporal constraint. Traffic here is often referred to as traffic jam because it deters mobility and causes a sort of spatio-temporal discontinuity. Like Dr. S, the previous slide, please. Yes, thank you. So it causes a sort of spatio-temporal discontinuity, which is why we're calling it spatial-temporal constraint, meaning that if you're stuck in traffic, you cannot move on to other places or implement certain chores because you're stuck in traffic. It's not just causes you to get stuck in space, but also causes you to get stuck in time sometimes. But here in Bangladesh, what's most important about traffic is that traffic is in a way non-negotiable. By that, I mean that in certain times of the day, there is no way that you can avoid the traffic that is the peak hour and you have to go through the traffic to go to one place. And this obviously has some sort of discontinual effects on someone's lives. And as a result, people don't really, since they can't really negotiate traffic, what they do is they fit various temporal categories around traffic. For example, if traffic was a fixed pin in a board, the other temporal categories, for example, breakfast, lunch, dinner, and things of that sort, would be fitted around traffic or resequenced to make time for traffic. So what we're trying to say here that due to this temporal force, academics were forced to sequence or resequence their temporal categories. The next slide, please, Dr. So we talk about how academics resequence their temporal categories. Dr. The next slide, please. Thank you. So we talk about how academics resequence their lives around traffic or within traffic. First of all, here we can see an example of customizing and folding temporal categories within traffic. But before that, I'd like to give an example how other temporal categories are fitted around traffic. We had a faculty who lived pretty far away from his campus. He had his own car and he drove, but because of the traffic, because he had to drive a long way, he woke up at 4 in the morning. He worked out, had his oatmeal breakfast, and then he left for office at 6 a.m. while the rest of his family was asleep. After reaching and he also did this because of if he reached late due to traffic, he would not have parking space in the office. That is why, to avoid traffic, to reach on time and to have the parking space, he started for office at 6. But while after reaching his office, he had about almost 5 hours till he had to teach. During this time, he completed the remaining morning rituals of his, like he had tea, he read the newspaper, and you can see how he fitted various temporal categories around traffic or resequenced them. Here we can also see a clock time logic sort. And now in this slide, we can see how customizing and folding temporal categories can happen within traffic. This is an example of a faculty whose pseudonym is Isha. She's a professor. She also lives pretty far away. She has a car, but she does not herself drive. She has a chauffeur to drive around. So what we hear from her is that Dr. The previous slide, please. The slide of Isha. Yeah, thank you. So what we hear from Isha is that Isha does not start as early as Niloy, although she too has to stay stuck in traffic. But what she does instead is that when she is in the traffic, stuck in traffic, she uses that time to prep for the class. She does calls during that time, networking, and many other stuff. So what she says, right, you can see bolded out here, we're making use of this traffic jam. The first thing I do is do all the calls, everyone and everything I need to do. I do a little preparation. So what we see here is Isha is fitting the temporal categories within traffic time. She's resequencing them to be within traffic time in a way. And she is not doing the same thing as Niloy, although their situations, what I said from up until now, almost integrates the same thing, both live very far away. What you see is Isha has her father-in-law living with her, meaning that she must have breakfast with her. That is why, and with him, that is why she cannot start as early as Niloy. And she does not drive. She has a chauffeur, which means she has a temporal resource to use the time within traffic. And technology, telecommunication helps her in this regard. Here we can see how global capital can affect the way of life in Bangladesh. The next slide, please, Dr. In this slide, we talk about, again, how customizing how folding social time with collective commute time works. Here we have Mila. She also lives pretty far away, but she does not have or does not use a car of her own. Instead, she uses the university transportation, which is a bus. So what she tells us is that as you can see bolded out here, I developed a social circle with my colleagues on the bus, and she says you can also find somewhere in this code that she doesn't have much time for friendly life, social life anymore because she has to stay in the university. She's also a mother, and she has to stay in traffic. So what she does is she's made a compromise in a way, her words, not mine, compromise, which is she developed a social circuit with her colleagues. So here she folded social time with collective commute time. She also did something which is very interesting. Not just her, the people from her bus, they are also collaborating, doing collaborative projects together. They knew each other from the bus, but now which has turned into networking in a way, a professional relationship as well. So you see here, she folded social time and in a way networking time as well with her collective commute time. And here we can also see the lack of the same sort of temporal resources as the previous two respondents, how that has given her this situation and how social differences can work. So that is how traffic can work and how traffic makes it in resequence temporal category. Next, Niloy will talk about politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. So she talked about traffic, and I think you can hear it from my side. Traffic is almost omnipresent in Bangladesh. I tried hard to cancel the noise, but it doesn't work always. So I will talk about party-based university politics. The university politics we are talking about is not a mere departmental or internal office politics. University politics here in Bangladesh, that's dominant in Bangladeshi public universities, is mainly national political party-based politics. So basically, university politics is a structural temporal constraint which manifests a shomoyscape by compelling the faculty to prioritize university politics, or either synchronizing or asynchronizing their temporal experiences in and or around politics. Thus, the faculty recalibrate their temporal experiences, such as career trajectory or daily temporality. We are calling university politics a structural temporal constraint because it acts as a structural demand that they must recalibrate in order to fit into the temporal expectations demanded by others, according to Sarah Sharma. We have already seen that traffic acted as an unmovable pin. So similarly, we can metaphorically or maybe literally call party-based politics a tyrannical authority who reverts or punishes participants' careers. So party-based politics imposes the temporal imperatives of the ruling party inside the public university structure. For this reason, the faculty are often subjected to political time work, such as attending political events, maintaining connections with ruling party-based factions, and demonstrating political loyalty, and so on. Our first example is of Zareen, a female associate professor and chair of a social science department in a public university. Her example shows how a respondent synchronizes in and or around the party-based temporal order. Zareen shared that she faced immense obstacles from her colleagues for the first couple of months after assuming the role of the chairperson of her department. They formed groups to suspend her from her role, harassed her in the meetings, and so on. Due to her role, she had to communicate or work with the VC of her university. This provided her the space and time to show her loyalty. So she decided to prioritize politicking. Considering Schulz's argument demonstrated in this slide, so the executive university leadership in Bangladeshi public universities are considered political posts rather than administrative roles. In this quote showed in the slide, we can see that she negotiated her childcare duties to greet her VC at a celebration event. That means she recalibrated her time to prioritize the VC. She arranged her interview with us on that same day. And she also ran late to attend the interview as she prioritized the celebration event. The former part of our interview was interrupted constantly as Zareen worked with her colleagues to change the title of a proposed speaker series to align the title with the celebration of the 100th birthday of the father of the nation. We heard her concerns about how the university leadership expected each of the units to align their activities with such a celebration event. Zareen was also drafting some exam questions while talking to us. So for the whole session, she was time juggling. She was folding other temporal categories with each other, except the event with the VC. The next example is of Shobuj. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah. So the next example is of Shobuj, who was introduced earlier. Shobuj is not aligned with party-based politics and experienced a Shomoyscape asynchronous with the politics-dominated temporal order. Contrary to Zareen, Shobuj calibrated his whole life in and or around activism in opposition to the ruling party-based politics. Shobuj significantly chose an on-campus resident along with his family to alleviate the impact of party-based politics on the students' campus experience. We want to note that public university students' residential halls are also controlled by student organizations aligned with the ruling political party. In the 2016 article, Anderson noted that taking control of such halls is important for the student organizations to involve new students in ruling party aligned political activism, and it includes expulsion and violence versus safety and tangible benefits such as access to residential halls, money, cigarettes, or food, and so on. It depends on a student's loyalty. So Shobuj chose to live on campus so he can provide assistance to the students affected by the ruling party aligned activists as soon as possible. This included getting a call at 2 a.m. to save a student from severe political beating, or sacrificing his leisure time for students' well-being, and so on. He also shared that he didn't want the students to experience similar frustrations he experienced as a student due to party-based politics and teaching quality. So he traveled to the past to evoke temporal agency in the present. So according to Shobuj, university politics stifled university administration from functioning smoothly, as there were no set guidelines for evaluating academic activities like teaching, research, etc. Consequently, according to him, faculty supporting the ruling party-based political factions were preoccupied with their promotion and access to resources through politicking. So they get a promotional advantage and in their career because of the ruling party alignment. So he also shared that the VC told him to disengage from his anti-establishment political activism when he applied for a promotion, having the best credential among the applicants. But his resistant position delayed his career progression. Shobuj expressed similar concerns as a Chinese faculty who expressed temporal frustrations with the lack of well-developed administrative support system described in Wang's 2020 article. So Shobuj and Zareen's temporal agencies show how our respondents are strategic users of time who manage to redefine their temporal experiences in two different ways. While Zareen is recalibrating her daily temporality to prioritize politics, Shobuj is calibrating his life to asynchronize in and around party-based politics. So next, Dr. Riyad will show how relationality manifests Shomoyscapes in our respondents' lives. Thank you.
Okay, so far as Emma and Niloy has described, we've discussed how our respondents are navigating Shomoyscapes that are derived from a precarious physicality, the space like traffic, or structural constraints, the one that Niloy just shared about university party-based politics. Here, what we're going to talk about is how one's Shomoyscapes is aligned with the temporal needs of others and is informed by relationality. And we're going to describe some examples where one of the things that was very interesting as we talked to the various faculty is how one was customizing and recalibrating one's temporal experience in and around caring for others. And by caring for others, which we are also referring to care time, is really addressing futurity and well-beings of one's parents, children, and or family. And what was interesting is we're discussing faculty and their career trajectories. Some of them discussed how they moved from one institution to another because they were looking for temporal flexibility. In other words, more autonomy with time because they had a child with special needs or they had an elder. Or some of them even talked about how they recalibrated their whole career. So one person talked about how they moved from working in an international NGO, and because they needed to be in Dhaka itself, joined an academic position because they could find more flexibility because they had a terminally ill parent and was the one responsible for that terminally ill parent's healthcare needs. And so it's not just simply about tweaking one's week or daily temporal rhythm, but it was also even shifting one's whole career centered around caring for the others. So here, Shomoyscape was a little bit different. It manifested as faculty enacted temporal agency in response to relational temporal constraints that were tied to either the future of somebody or the now, the present, okay? So for instance, this is a narrative from Mahmoud, and Mahmoud is a associate professor in the social sciences at a private university. And when we were interviewing him, he was amidst a kind of a family situation which was preoccupying. And what was the problem? He was talking about how his land that his mom inherited was going to be taken over by the government. And so his mom was very frustrated, and that even frustrated him because he couldn't work. So he was talking about how he couldn't work. He says, if my family members are upset, I cannot do anything. So that's my first priority to take care of. And so then he talks about how the government is going to make a rail line or a platform or something like that. They're acquiring lands. So my mother is very upset because this land is given by her mother. So in other words, her mother inherited it from her own mother. So she is upset. And if she is upset, I know that I can't do anything. And Mahmoud is very interesting because he also got his doctoral degree in the West, but he actually moved because he wanted to take care of his parents, and he's the firstborn. So here we see an example of how, because of the preoccupation at work with the battle over land property and so forth, here a Shomoyscape is constructed by one, his temporal agency reflecting local relational logics, in other words, futurity of family property, past inheritance, resulting in him recalibrating and allocating for care time. In other words, he, instead of working at work, he was more preoccupied, as he says, with the local government. He was making phone calls with the government's local gunda banda. These are like thugs, local politicians, financial. So he was basically, because of this constraint with land precarity, he was folding the connections with these different offices during his work schedule. So Mahmoud's time work involved recalibrating his work time and folding the temporal rhythms of these various offices. So here you see a Shomoyscape that engages both his temporal agency, in other words, how he recalibrates and folds time during work, but also this is a response to the temporal constraints around land precarity, okay? Another dominant theme we emerged, and this is an example we're going to share, and many of us who are in the COVID situation who have small children can relate to this, but this is a bit different, is how complex Shomoyscapes were instigated by childcare for forcing faculty to engage in temporal agency, in other words, accommodate child's temporal needs. And this was particularly among female academics. So just like many gendered academies around the world, childcare and family care is gendered in the Bangladeshi context, and female academics face significant barriers with their career trajectories and work-life balance. And here we're going to share a narrative from Neela, who we had introduced, who talked about commute time and networking time by being part of the bus university bus system. Here, what she's doing is she's comparing her experiences with her Swedish colleagues and notes the discrepancies in schooling and childcare. She says their childcare facilities are very good. The schooling facilities are very good. For an extracurricular activity of my son, we have to go to a different school. We have to go to art classes, recitation classes, but they can complete this in their Swedish schools. Also, and here she's talking about just the precarity around child safety. Because of my social condition, the condition of Dhaka city, I can't let my son travel alone. He's not independent. And so she's talking about how the Swedish enjoy weekends, but here in Dhaka, even if I'm free, I can't do this because my child is not free. He's going to school on Saturdays, so I can't. So basically what Nila's temporal landscape here, her narrative highlights, is that she's experiencing a temporal landscape that is composed of both temporal constraints, which are tied to lack of social infrastructure in schooling and broader society, but also her temporal agency as she recalibrated her temporal rhythms and accommodates and prioritizes her child's commute time to address them in order to address the child's learning futurity and child safety. And basically, according to Nila lacked the privilege, borrowing from Sarah Sharma, the privileges of commodities, policies, plans, programs, and labor of others that her Swedish colleagues enjoyed in terms of childcare, schooling facilities, and free weekends. So with that, hopefully this kind of gives you a sense of the efficacy and the way Shomoyscape manifested among our participants. And to conclude, we suggest that due to rapid urbanization, social and infrastructural precarity, that these kinds of social constraints and created larger temporal constraints that created multifaceted, non-autonomous temporalities. In other words, in the Dhaka context among our faculty, there is no such thing as autonomous temporality. It was always part of an assemblage. These same constraints also offered openings, i.e. agency, by anchoring our participants to resist, i.e. productivity or linear career trajectories. As you saw examples from Mahmoud and others, they were more concerned about the relational rather than the career trajectories, or even Shabuj in talking about mobilizing his temporal agency with students. Or appropriating modern clock time, i.e. rescheduling, scheduling, time control to navigate such constraints. So in other words, temporal constraints are intimately tied to instigating Shomoyscapes that to varying degrees were inseparable from precarity, space, hybridity, relationships, and agency. So now one could say, well, you know, all the things you've discussed here, indeed, traffic, commute time, university politics, or caring responsibilities are also concerns of faculty in other parts of the world. But what our analysis foregrounds is the precarity that stems from outside the walls of the universities, infrastructural precarity in Dhaka traffic, external national party-based politics, or larger societal precarity tied to lack of schooling infrastructure, lack of childcare, things like that, as playing a major role in the Shomoyscapes that were instigated. So in terms of future research, we suggest that, you know, we could look at in future, how does Shomoyscape look similar or vary in other rapidly developing economies like Central Asia, Vietnam, who are aspiring to become middle income countries? How do we revisit the scholarship of academic temporality from global South context? What new questions can we ask? How does Shomoyscapes vary among global South faculty who have also experienced academic mobility? As you see, for instance, Shabuj's example, it's interesting for those who have lived abroad, how they bring time maps with them when they come back. And so to end, what we will suggest is that Shomoyscapes really helps us to introduce a new kind of heuristic and helps us foreground new problems, connections, and entanglements, structuring human social relations in different arenas of social life. With that, we'll end here. Thank you. And I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Riyad. Thank you, Niloy and Emma. Thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. At this time, I'd like to invite questions from those attending to access the Q&A. If you're on a laptop like I am, if you move the cursor, you'll notice the Q&A there at the bottom. If you're on a cell phone, you may need to move around a little bit to find it. while we're waiting for questions, I'd like to actually pose a question to you all. At the very beginning, Professor Riyad Shahjahan, Riyad, you mentioned that most of this research was undertaken in right before the COVID, before the pandemic hit. And I'd be curious to know if you could, for all three of you actually, to discuss the impact of COVID in the context of Dhaka, and to comment on whether there are new insights or developments that may impact Dhaka looking ahead.
Yeah, so to answer your question, I just was in Dhaka in December, and I was visiting there for various reasons. But I would say that all the things we discuss about precarity has been exacerbated in terms, I mean, traffic will stay the same. It doesn't matter for COVID or not, right? But in terms of, one of the things that Emma can share as being students, we talk about traffic in terms of physical traffic, but now because of COVID, there's also internet traffic. In other words, the bandwidths are another form of precarity that is shaping the country. It's particularly with students trying to access higher education institutions and learning and things like that. So that's part of it. But then there's precarity with family. But to be honest with you, I was in Bangladesh. There is no such thing as social distancing. People don't care. Again, it's like people just want to be with each other. And right now in December, it's wedding season. So there's lots of big parties going on. And so there's all these different things, but I'll let Niloy and Emma share their insights about how COVID has exacerbated and whether or not Shomoyscape is similar or different now.
I'd like to add a point to the how COVID has exacerbated the precarity relating to traffic. For example, the government passed rules as to that people cannot, the buses that are serviced have to operate at 50% capacity. This increased the bus fares, but you see, this rule was passed under the impression that the offices will be closed. People won't have to go to offices, but offices are not closed. People are having to go to offices, and the buses, they're not taking more than 50%. So many people are having to walk miles and miles just to reach their workplaces. So the precarity has exacerbated and increased in ways that we did not think that it could increase before. Niloy, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, there are some things I can add. I completed my post-graduation in 2019. So basically, I am not a student as I was before the COVID. So I observed the other sector of the of Bangladeshi life, like say like the formal job. So what happened, like all I mean physical offices were closed, but people were working from home. And what happened is, like I heard it from many of my seniors and other friends that like a formal, when you are physically in the office, we can work from 8 to 5. Actually, there is no formal that kind of time restriction in Bangladesh. People do overtime a lot, and it's very hectic. I'm going through it right now. So what happened, that people had to work from home. So as there is no, I mean, yeah, in pen and papers you have to work from 8 to 5, but when you're from working from home, you're always connected to your supervisors and staff and bosses. So many of my friends and other seniors, they experienced huge workloads. And some of my friends, they say that they don't want to work anymore in their offices and in their organizations. Like there was a huge workload because they're at home and they have to work all day. Like there is no time bound. So that became gray. And there were also economic problems, like in the formal job sectors. Many people I mean receive some kind of supports from their organizations, but most of the cases, I think there are statistical evidences probably that many organizations, they downsized their employees, and many people lost their jobs. And mostly the most interesting thing is the informal job sectors, like people who are working class. So I mean, they have to earn their wages daily. So whatever it is, there are lockdowns or not, they have to go to work. Otherwise, they can't feed their family. So people wear masks here. I mean, there is no kind, there are not that kind of, I didn't experience such things like that, we don't want to wear masks because it's our right, personal rights. That's not the thing, but people actually, people don't wear masks deliberately. I think they wear masks because if they don't, then then police will beat them. I mean, I asked some of the people, and yeah, they have to go to work whether it's lockdown or not, or they can't feed their families. So they have to go to their work, and to avoid, to gain access to the mobility, to gain, avoid police beatings, they wear masks. So that's the kind of logic here. And yeah, more, so there is two issues that I observe. One is about time, and another is about mobility. That's all I can say right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We do actually have a question here, but before we get to that question, and I want to encourage others to type in their questions, I'd just like to build on this last question while we're on the subject. Because of these experiences with COVID, I wonder, looking ahead to the future, what is your sort of forecast, if you will, for how this will impact society in Dhaka? And this could be for anyone, any of the panelists.
I personally, again, this is beyond the scope of our work. I personally don't see it. It's very class-based. For some people, the reality is dire, like Niloy pointed out. Like, it doesn't matter if it's COVID or not, they have to work, because if they don't work, they can't feed their families, right? It's also relative, in terms of, like, if you're in a more upper class, yes, you can self-isolate and blah blah blah, but that's not the case for many. It also has a lot of gendered issues around childcare and stuff. But with that said, it's very class-based. So for instance, we didn't talk about this, but among middle-class mothers, they also have childcare in terms of nannies who look after their children, right? So they can still work because they have someone, or they have in-laws, or because they're part of extended families who can take care of childcare and things like that, right? But in terms of the workplace itself, it also varies between public versus private sectors. The private sectors are much more draconian in terms of accountability and work time, like you have to be there at a particular time, or you have to get things done. So there's that. I mean, we could answer that question in terms of universities. I mean, that's another completely different, I don't know what to call it, can of worms in terms of what's happening. I mean, schools right now have been mostly online, but they are now shifting because of vaccination rates, whereby now students, I don't know, Emma, what student life is like, but I know from Emma's, we always talk about this, how her exams keep getting postponed. But that's before even COVID. This used to happen because of party-based politics, but COVID exacerbates that even more. So I don't know if that answers, but the forecast to me is, it again depends on who you're talking about.
Yes. Thank you. I don't know if Emma or Niloy would like to add to that.
Well, I think Doctor has covered it pretty much.
Okay, very good. Okay, very good. Well, we have a question here from Professor Salah Hassan, and Professor Salah Hassan is the director of Global Studies in the Arts and Humanities, one of our co-sponsors. Professor Hassan writes, "I'm not quite seeing the difference between Shomoyscapes and Adam's theorization of timescapes. Isn't your distinction a form of cultural relativism? Could one just say that different cultural contexts have different constraints on their time? But don't we all experience time similarly in global capitalism? Are you familiar with Fabian's book, Time and the Other?"
Yeah, great question, Salah. And I wouldn't expect any less from Salah. But anyway, to answer your question, Salah, yes, we do see some differences between Shomoyscapes and Adams. So Adams' theorization of timescapes is based on modern society. It's basically the idea of industrial time. It's about linearity and showing how linearity impacts linear time impacts modern society, particularly around environmental consequences and things like that. But what Shomoyscape is doing is talking more about the relational logics. In other words, the relationships between people, culture, and family, and how that is foregrounded in Shomoyscapes. But also Shomoyscape, which Adam doesn't really talk about in terms of timescape, is the larger role of societal precarity. That is happening in global South context that shapes a particular type of temporal landscape. That doesn't mean it is not present in the West, because the global South is here as well, right? But yeah, it is different. So when you say that, yes, indeed, different cultural contexts have different constraints on their time. And I agree that we do experience time. By time in global capitalism, we're talking about clock time. Indeed, clock time is very much present in the global South context. We can't separate that. But I think what Shomoyscape is talking about is that hybrid nature of time, that you have both modern clock time to navigate things, but also local constraints, such as traffic, such as party-based university politics. That's not something that's universal. That is a context-specific thing. And yes, we are familiar with Fabian's book Time and the Other, but that's again a more of an anthropological account, which has applications, but is different because we're talking about a temporal agency that is also often not discussed in many of these theorizations.
I don't know if Emma or Niloy would like to add to that.
I think Dr. S made a fair point to the question.
Can you hear me? I am having some internet difficulties, but can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so I should keep my video off. I'm having a lot of traffic, internet traffic here. So I just want to add a little point that how this is different. Like we interviewed some of our respondents who traveled abroad, traveled to the West I mean, for higher studies and so on, like Shobuj, and there were other respondents, and many of them, I think most of them, all of them who traveled abroad, they say that they had autonomy on time in the West, and some of them also traveled back, tried to travel back with that autonomy in Bangladesh, but they saw that it doesn't work here. So I mean, conceptually, when we were coding our interviews and reading the text, so we saw that, I mean, yeah, there is many differences. Like this autonomy of time can most of them say that this autonomy of time doesn't work here. So we needed a much more complex and culture specific, or what kind of say, I mean, a new framework, expanded framework, which will include cultural logics and collective agency that we cannot express with this Western concept of autonomy of time, or Western tendency of autonomy of time. So I think that I think that proves my point. Thank you.
Thank you, Niloy.
I'd like to add one point also as well,
Mhm.
which is when we say global South, we don't just mean the geographical global South. We mean this that can be present in the North as well. For example, migrant communities and so forth. So what we're trying to say here is that the global South, the things that we are talking about, the way temporality is perceived in the type of global South that we're talking about, is not very prioritized in the Northern literatures. That is what we were going for. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you. And I have to say, yeah, this concept of Shomoyscapes is really groundbreaking. So I appreciate you sharing this with us. Let's see. It seems that, there is actually a follow-up here from Professor Salah Hassan. He says, thanks. I have a follow-up. Would the paradigm of Shomoyscapes be applicable to other contexts, such as in Bengal, India, or Pakistan, or even beyond South Asia, say Egypt or Indonesia?
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of our implications. And it's not just about non-Western contexts. One of the things we say, and I didn't share that, I mean, we run out of time, is that many of the things we're talking about Shomoyscape applies in the pandemic context in many parts of the world. That's number one, because the relational logics we're talking about, the constraints with internet, things like that, are precarity that many people are facing. But more importantly, like, Professor Mohammed Khalil and I, before we start, we talked about Egypt. And we've read studies on Egypt and Cairo and what happens, for instance, Ramadan and the social orchestration of time. But many of the things, when I have talked to my students in Egypt, many of the things we're describing about Bangladeshi academics apply there. Traffic is present no matter what in Cairo, right? The relational logics we're talking about in terms of Muslim epistemology, all those things also apply. So yeah, indeed, it does apply to many parts of the world. Unfortunately, the problem we see with a lot of the literature on temporality is we always borrow from the North to make sense of the South. And this is where Connell's work is so important, is to say what kind of heuristics can become from these contexts themselves to make sense, rather than borrow and then just apply. Not to say we are not doing that, but we've changed it. And I think there's something about using heuristics coming from global South context that's very important in the politics of knowledge production in academy, particularly in temporality literature. So yes, while Fabian writes about the other, again, how much of the other is articulating time is the question we have to ask ourselves.
Yes, thank you so much. By the way, Salah, I should tell you, you may have noticed this, but Riyad responded with a link to the article. For those who maybe can't see the link, can you tell us which journal it's published in?
Yeah, actually, if you don't mind, I meant to share the screen for that. So let me quickly share the screen to show you. I forgot to do that. So it's out in Time and Society, and it just came out this December. So.
Excellent.
Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing.
Very good. Thank you so much. Well, seeing as there are no other questions, I'd like to turn it over back to the panelists, see if there are any final comments they'd like to make.
Well, I was just curious about others who are in the audience, whether or not this resonated with them, particularly in the pandemic conditions. I'm just curious if this, I mean, we're hoping it will resonate, but we're not sure. I mean, we talk about Bangladesh, but as I said, given what's going on with the pandemic, and maybe there are others from other parts of the world in our audience who could share whether or not this resonates, or maybe this is too foreign.
Well, I'll say this, somebody who's been to Egypt numerous times, it certainly resonated with me. And honestly, you could just replace a few terms and apply it to Egypt.
Yeah.
And it would work really well. Yeah, so certainly it resonated with me. Let's see here if there are other, well, while we had to, here we go. Here's an anonymous attendee writes, I would just like to say that I found it interesting to hear from Niloy that the workload was considered more during COVID when working from home, when here in the United States, working from home was considered easily for many people due to having the access to the technology. Would you say technology would have been a big component to adding leverage to the workload? I'm aware technology is always developing, but I'm not aware in how it is functioning in Bangladesh. Thank you for that. Let's, I don't know if Niloy or others would like to.
I mean, what happened actually, say, there it's kind of like temporal categories. Like I'm in the office, say I'm physically in the office. I have to start from 9 a.m. and I have to go home at 5 p.m. So I mean, I can say that outside 9 to 5, I have other duties. But in the pandemic situation, things are all, I mean, folded together and stuff. Like I'm working at my home, and I'm also chatting with my friends. I'm also eating. I'm also visiting my parents, and I'm home, like so on. But the problem is that like, I mean, what I have experienced in Bangladeshi organizations, like I mean, in probably in West, I have no experience of West right now, but probably in West, they have some work ethics, like, and like from 9 to 5, and then they have their personal lives. Uh, Things are not like that in here. I don't know why it happened. I mean, many people were have to work outside their office time. They overtime. They work at home and stuff. I mean, not always deliberately. The work ethics or the work rules, they are mostly on pen and papers. And what I can say, I mean, labor exploitation is a thing here. I mean, everybody exploits labor here. I mean, and that's huge. That's huge. But the thing is, it's very hard to get a job. There is a high rate of unemployment, and people cannot talk against that. So they have to do that. So and that happened in, I mean, in COVID. Like, yeah, they can. I mean, technology brought us closer and so on. Like, so they also brought those, I mean, those work pressures closer. I mean, people can always contact now. The superiors in the office can always contact the juniors and say, do this and do that. I mean, even if they just like, they don't even say like that you have to do this or you will be expelled or something. Like, do this and do that, but I mean, secure their job, to get the wager, they always do that. They always do their duties and stuff. I mean, yeah, and it's, I mean, in foreground culture, it's like, okay, you can do this if you have time. They may say that, the superior can say that you can do this if you have time, but actually in the background culture, even this sentence has a lot of pressure on the juniors. They have to do that because their boss said that. So I mean, a time controlling, micromanage controlling, this is a thing here. I mean, it's very, I mean, it's all everywhere. So
Yeah,
that's
I
how,
wanted to.
I mean, technology brought us closer in socially, but technology also brought the work pressures closer to us in
I think
Bangladesh.
yeah, 3 points I want to add. One is that technology is omnipresent in terms of cell phones. I mean, this is a big part of urban society, but also in rural society. So you don't have to have a computer. Cell phones are constantly, people are on calls, and it's a big business too. The whole infrastructure is a huge business. Telecommunications is very big right now. But more importantly, I think what Niloy is saying, that's again very important for us to compare with, say, the US, is that the role of there is no social infrastructure for you being unemployed, right? Like, you won't get bank checks or any other checks or anything like that. Unemployment insurance, there's no such thing. So therefore, the precarity with being unemployed is very real, and the amount of labor supply is very big. Therefore, trying to please your bosses are very important. And so there's that precarity of unemployment that no one wants to experience, particularly amidst a pandemic, right? But more importantly, and given what we just said about the collective nature of the culture in terms of seniors and so forth, people are conforming. They have to conform. So that's really, really important. Let me just give you an example, and it's got nothing to do with technology, but technology exasperates that. When I was in Dhaka and I was attending weddings, people were up till 2 a.m. for weddings because they had family obligations, and then going to work the next day at 6 or 7 a.m. And this was like nearly every day, because they had to fulfill family obligations, but job obligations. The amount of sleep people do, when we interviewed our faculties across among the 22, very rarely did anyone say we got 7 to 8 hours. It was mostly 4 to 5 maximum, because of the precarious nature of living in a Dhaka context because of traffic and things like that, but with work also. So I'm using the wedding example as, on the one hand, you have to attend family obligation. On top of that, you're still having to meet the workplace things. Now, the other thing that I think I want to add with Niloy is that here, for instance, and we discussed this in another paper that is under review about work-life balance. Here, there's this idea that you can, keep your boundaries between work, or like you have your calendar a Google Calendar and you can put, here's my time for this, here's my time for that. I mean, that's what people can do. That is unheard of in Bangladesh, simply because you might have this in slotted, but something will come up like land precarity or something with family, or another person comes in and says, hey, I need you to do this. And it's very hard to say no. So this idea of here, I'm going to manage my time and map my time for my week or daily calendar. If you're in a privileged position, you can do that. But the more you are at the bottom of the totem pole, your time is controlled by others, and technology exasperates that because you're more in touch now.
Adding to that, I'd like to say that here in Bangladesh, everywhere the internet is not as good. So, for example, if a person whose office is in Dhaka, but his family lives in a village in a remote place. So when he goes during the pandemic, say per se, we have work from home, lockdown. So what he will do is he is expected to go back to his village home to look after his family, but he or she will have trouble doing work from home because of the internet. And this will add to the pressure because you have to always be present. You know, that is a challenge that we also face. You also face in global north, I think, the idea of always being present. So in during work from home, you have to always be present regardless of 5 to 9 work hours and so forth. And so here, the precarity with internet, even if you were in Dhaka, you have a good stable internet. The stable internet is not stable during these times when the traffic is high. So yeah.
Thank you, Emma. Niloy, did you want to add to that?
I want to add another two things about technology. One is that technology in Bangladesh is, booming. Technology means, communications technology, especially. It's a government policy, like digitalize the whole country within 2021 and stuff. So yeah, they invested a lot on communications technology, especially cell phones and stuff. And this is one thing. And another thing is that most of the things, getting a job, getting a good house, getting access to resources, mostly works on the basis of networking. Who is connected to whom. So, literally, people have to invest their time for networking, for good networking, to get connected with other people, get connected with good, powerful, or people with capitals, social, cultural, or anything. So yeah, that's how this technology works here, mostly communication technologies. They have to connect with other people, they have to get connected, and they have to please people with power, higher power, or people with higher status to get access to resources. Most of the things here in Bangladesh works like that. So I think that's how the COVID brought the work pressure on people. That could be another reason. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I don't know, Riyad, do you wanted to add anything to that? Okay, we do actually have another question or comment here. Very good and well explained examples. Thank you. I'm currently an undergraduate in the process for admission for Hale here at MSU, and I found this meeting very informative. Thank you very much. Very good. Excellent. Well, seeing as there are no other questions, let me then turn it back to the panel and see if they have final comments or observations.
Please read our work. And we have other stuff coming out. We've got a paper on work-life balance, again, challenging the global North literature around work-life balance that we see oftentimes talked about in the Western context, particularly in the academic context. We also have work coming out on academic mobility. This is a very important thing, and it goes back to Salah's question. One of the things that Adam and many of the time scholars don't talk about is the role of transnational relationships and how transnationality or the mobility of people shapes their time maps. That's something that's very much not theorized in some of, this is not to say they don't explore that, but it's not something that's very much foregrounded. And so when we talk about academic mobility, we talk about people moving using cultural norms, but we don't talk about time maps, how people bring time maps when they study abroad and bring it back. For instance, we have examples whereby people went abroad and then they bring back this priority towards research back with them, that they prioritize research in their lives, things like that. So it's very interesting. So yeah.
Thank you.
And
yeah.
I would like to say that this has been this has been great, very great to hear that our work resonates with people from from other areas. Like for example, how you said it resonates with Cairo, and this is always amazing to see how our work can be relatable. Thank you for having us, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you so much, Emma. Niloy, if you'd like to add anything?
Yeah, thank you for this honor. Yeah, I feel very great to present here with you, along with you, and yeah, and we also presented this while we were working on this paper. We presented in South Africa, we presented in India, and interestingly, we have heard similar issues from them, similar experiences. Like our friends from India, they say that yeah, in big cities they experience almost similar kind of party-based politics in higher education sectors, and they face similar issues. In South Africa, they also said, yeah, they find similarities with our paper and our experiences. So it was a great journey, and it will be a great journey for me to work on these issues and this stuff. And yeah, I am very grateful to everyone, to Michigan State University, to Dr. Riyad, to Muslim Studies Department, to Hale and everyone. And our readers, I thank every one of you, and please read our work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to say personally, I found this to be very interesting and eye-opening, and I appreciate this learning about Shomoyscapes. I'm going to have to incorporate this language now in my own discourse. This is great. Well, I want to thank you all. I want to thank Professor Riyad Shahjahan for initiating this. I want to thank Niloy and Emma for the research, and for, I just realized this is a Thursday night, and so thank you for devoting your Thursday night to us. We appreciate it. And thanks to everyone else for joining us. And that concludes our session. Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Bye.